Thank you very much, and let me say it's a great pleasure being here. One of your founders is somebody I know very well, Pramod Bhasin, and he often said to me that when you're in Chandigarh, you must go and see Plaksha, because that's the future of Indian universities, and I'm delighted to be able to visit and talk to the students. I realize that you're all doing a very wide variety of things, ranging from just policy to data analysis to game theory, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, a really impressive range of subjects. I'm going to sort of talk about what they call the challenges facing, and it really means the current policy issues, tailored to an audience which has your breadth of knowledge in terms of range, and assuming that you're all interested in current issues. And one of the important things really is that, whenever these things are discussed, they're grossly oversimplified. So I think it's very important to realize that what you read in the newspapers about something tends to be a hugely oversimplified version. And if you really try to get into it in detail, you can get lost, because a complete narrative is a very, very detailed and can get out of hand. So somewhere in between, analysis serves the purpose of, if you like, shrinking the issue to something that's a little more manageable, but at the same time, enabling you to subject it to some analysis. And the trouble is that if you actually broaden it to its full complexity, the analysis would become unbelievably difficult. So keep this basically at the back of your mind. Now, when people talk about policy challenges facing India and all the rest of it, the challenges are a function of what you want to achieve. If you're quite happy with an economic growth of about 3% or 4%, there are no challenges facing India. We'll get that anyway. But the real challenge is nobody in his right mind would be satisfied with that. And so the question is, we want to aim for better. And we've done that consistently in the past. Now the difference is that the vision very often that's outlined is no longer what's the next 5 years going to be. It's a longer term, sort of Viksit Bharat notion. There's nothing wrong with that. Whether you have a 5-year or 20-year, it's not the case that one or the other is right. But the important thing about the Viksit Bharat is that it enables you to put across something that will ultimately appeal to the younger generation. That is, we want to become what is called a developed country by 2047. Now, if you're a young person at the age of 20, which is much closer to your age than it is to mine, it makes sense to say, well, what are we going to be like in 2047? I'm not going to be around in 2047, so that seems to be a rather distant future. But at the same time, whatever you're going to do by 2047, can be converted into what should we be doing in the next 5 years in order to get there. Now, some work has been done in trying to translate this Viksit Bharat vision into something a little more specific. And this is that's the first stage of policy making. I call it going from slogans to targets. Don't underestimate slogans. They're very important because they sort of energize people and their ambition. But you have to convert that slogan to a specific target. If you just get stuck with the slogan, you're getting nowhere. So the specific target is, okay, let's accept Viksit Bharat. What does it mean? Clearly, one thing which the government has itself said is sort of becoming a developed country. There is a definition of developed country which the World Bank has, which is essentially that per capita national income somewhere around $14,000. We are kind of 3,000 or so. So if you can get to $14,000 in today's prices, you get out of the middle income range and you get into the bottom of the higher income range. So we all agree that by then we should call ourselves developed. So this raises a question, how much growth do you need to do that? And then there are many ways of calculating that growth. Do you do it in dollars? Do you do it in rupees? Do you do it in what exchange rate? Do you do purchasing power parity? What have you? I think most people think that to get there in real terms, we would need to grow between 8 and 8.5% per year from now to 2047. Now, the first qualification that comes in is that being a developed country doesn't just mean per capita income. It's perfectly possible to have a very high per capita income. I mean, many mineral-based economies have it, but it's not distributed enough. So very few people enjoy that, a few people enjoy a huge amount. So I think the general idea really is that it should be a high per capita income, but it should also be an inclusive process. That is, enough people are going to experience this growth of income. Linked to that is the notion that, look, it's not just the inclusiveness, we just shouldn't have any poverty. So that becomes a third dimension. And of course, the moment you say poverty, it becomes a huge argument. What is poverty? I mean, if you define poverty in terms of some consumption level, which was defined 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever, you would come to a certain number. And actually, if you use those numbers, it's already clear that poverty has gone down very substantially. But then, people would say that, look, poverty is not an absolute number. I mean, in any society, you should call a person poor if their consumption level is below, let's say, 1/3 of the mean consumption. This would mean that as the mean consumption goes up, the poverty line also goes up. And the idea is there should be fewer and fewer people below that rising line, okay? So a concept of poverty and getting rid of it is very important. The other thing is that it cannot be just in terms of your income. It has to be also in terms of what you might call the availability of public goods. You can have a lot of income, but if you don't have health and you don't have education, you don't have clean air, that income is of very little use to you or not enough use. So you want to define a developed country status as one in which there's a higher level of per capita income, it's more inclusive, there are very few people or really a small number that are poor, and there's a wide range of public goods that are available to everybody, and they would certainly include things like health, they would include things like education, and frankly, they would include things like law and order and personal safety. I mean, whatever community you belong to, you must be assured of personal safety, and particularly independent of community, there's a gender aspect. I mean, a woman must feel perfectly safe going around at night. And this idea that, look, that can't be guaranteed, so women shouldn't move out at night is totally wrong. So, you can in fact list a multiplicity of what you would call criteria, which would reflect the transition to higher income level. I think this can be done, and probably if you made a list, you could very easily get agreement on a list of about 10 things. Now, the next question is, how do you get there? I mean, what do you need to do in order to achieve these objectives? And that's really where the difficulty lies. Because in order to get there, there's always some assumption of the underlying determinants of that outcome, which is an analytical construct, okay? And that construct can be made more or less sophisticated. So it's possible to argue that, for example, even though your income is rising, okay, it may not flow down because you don't generate enough employment. And that's currently the debate going on in India. So then the issue is, why don't you generate enough employment? And you can have different views on that. I mean, one view would be that in order to generate enough employment, you need to do what other countries have done, which is you need to have an industrialization process which relies much more on export competitiveness, so that in the early stages you export labor-intensive goods, which the world needs. You could have a different view which says that no, that's okay, that's fine, but actually it's much more important to emphasize the medium and small industries, micro and small industries. And there the argument is they're the ones that create employment. But you know, that argument can also be questioned, because it is absolutely true that a huge amount of employment in our country is produced by the MSMEs, almost 90%. But from that to conclude that the MSMEs are a strength of the economy, it may be wrong. Because the real problem is we have not produced enough middle-scale enterprises that would employ between 500 to 2,000 people. And we have very few large enterprises which employ a certain number of people. Then we have a large MSME sector, most of which consists of very, very small enterprises, typically employing less than 10 people. I think if you look at the numbers, almost 90% of the units, certainly in manufacturing, hire less than 10 people. Now, this cannot be called a strength. What you've got is a missing middle. I mean, the strength of an industry would be a middle-scale industry which is maybe 4 or 5 times larger than it is now. And the other side of that same coin would be that many of the present small enterprises would actually disappear. So that's an example of structural change. And you know, whichever of you becomes a minister, you will find it very difficult to say this, that you go before a whole bunch of people, middle and small industry. They all love saying, you are the backbone of the Indian economy. We must back you completely. None of them say, our industry is dominated by small, low productivity, low quality work, with 90% of the units hiring less than 10 people. In order for India to develop, we need the top 10 or 15% of this lot becoming 5 times larger, which would mean they would swamp the others. Now, the people employed in the others would get employed in the expanded middle industry. But the guys who currently call themselves owners might have to take a job, because they will not anymore be industrialists, so-called. That's not easy for people to accept. Now, I think that's an example of the kind of structural change that policy needs to bring about. And I find that when people say employment is a big problem, and they're right. I mean, the data, if you look at it carefully enough, does show that. For a while, unfortunately, the government was denying that. And there were lots of people, middle-level people in the government saying, no, employment is growing. Some government economists digging out some data would say employment is growing. But I think that perception has changed, because the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, they're all saying employment is a big problem. So now people realize that it's a big problem. But what are you going to do in order to produce good quality employment? Are you going to produce a whole lot of SOPs for the present middle and small industries so that each one of them will get a little bit better, or each one of them will get a little bit more working capital, or the same amount of working capital at 1% less interest? Or are you going to bring about a structural change so you create a new and dynamic middle-scale industry which would actually lead to some destruction of the existing MSMEs? Personally, I think that's what you need to do. By the way, if I was standing for office, I wouldn't say this out frankly. And I think the 90% of the success of economic policy is a bit of a con game. I mean, life is tough, and development is an instance of structural change, and nobody actually wants structural change. Most people like a politician who says, trust me, I'm going to give you 8% growth. And each one of them likes to believe that that means that whatever I'm doing, the income from that will grow at 8% per year. That's not the case. What he should be saying is, I'm going to create a new structure of industry many of the existing jobs will disappear, but you'll find jobs in the new areas. And this is a very, very, it's not an economic issue, it's a human issue. I'll share with you, I don't know if any of you have read my book Backstage, but if you're interested in how these issues surfaced when the reforms began, let me make a reference to it. And there, in 1991 or 2, we were trying to push the computerization of the banks. Because our view was that, look, the world's changing, everywhere banking is getting computerized. I mean, if India doesn't computerize, and the public sector banks don't computerize, then the foreign banks which are computerized will actually get all the business. So we had a big job to do to persuade them. And the bank unions were completely against it. Absolutely. The communist unions, the Congress unions, and the BJP union, on this they were completely united. There's a bad idea that this will cause lots of jobs. Manmohan Singh actually called a whole bunch of the union leaders. He was finance minister, I was then finance secretary, to discuss with them and say, look, you want India to look good, and if we are to work in a world where people deal with us, we don't want them dealing with the foreign banks in India, we want them dealing with the Indian banks in India. It can't be done if the banks are not computerized. By the way, a few years before that, they had introduced computerization, but a very stupid kind of computerization. Stupid in the sense that the union said that, look, we don't approve of computerization because it'll cut jobs. So they said, no, it will not cut a single job. And what they said is, we need the computers in the back, but what we'll do is we'll limit the number of transactions that can be done in any one day, so that there'll be the computers will be there, but they won't lead to actually a larger volume of things being done with the same workforce. I mean, it was so silly, but the persons who were organizing it said, look, let's get the computers in. Once they're in, people will begin to sort of see the logic of it. Anyway, when these people were meeting Dr. Manmohan Singh, they're all saying to him, Finance Minister, I don't agree with this at all. And of course, he's a very polite person, as many of you probably know. And at the end of the meeting, he got up and went to the door of his room in order to shake hands with each trade unionist as they went out. So they were all quite pleased at this, So they shook hands. And then one of them, shaking hands, said, Finance Minister, I am not at all convinced by what you have said, but I don't mind admitting to you that my son thinks you're right. So, it's a very interesting case where the older fellows are stuck in a groove. Their own children are aware that, the world is changing. So somehow politicians have to get this across. And they have to get this across in a way in which people's self-respect is maintained, but at the same time, they themselves concede that this needs to be done. And I thought this was a wonderful example where this guy, he was actually signaling to Manmohan Singh that, listen, I've got to say this, but deep down, I know you're right. Now you do what you have to do, and I will keep saying what I have to keep saying, and let's see how it goes. So a lot of changes have to take place this way. And I think as analysts, you are not politicians, but as analysts, you need to keep clear what is the bogus part of public policy and what is the real part. Let me give you one or two other obvious sorts of examples. For example, today, lots of people say that, all this nonsense of economic reforms that these fellows have been peddling, since these fellows means people like me, since 1991, is all rubbish. Because the world has changed, man. It's no longer the old globalization, etc. Look at the world has changed. The Americans have become protectionists, this, that, and the other. This is, by the way, true, that in 1991, the world was much more committed to an open world leads to greater prosperity for everybody. That's because the US was the dominant power in the region, and they didn't mind others getting gradually more and more prosperous, and their own position slightly declining as a share of world GDP, but they were still undoubted top dog. That changed with a rapid growth of China. Now, by the way, that is partly also our fault, because if the rest of us had been as dynamic as China, then China would not have grown as fast as it did, and we would have grown faster. But the Chinese were the only ones who actually realized that we must take advantage of global trade big time. And therefore, they occupied a completely dominant position. And then a couple of years ago, Xi Jinping, the president of China, head of the Chinese Communist Party, converted the Chinese strategy, which earlier used to be gain strength, but keep your low profile. That's what Deng Xiaoping and people did, to a much more open challenge. He challenged the United States and said, look, we are going to challenge you technologically, we're going to challenge you militarily, we're going to challenge you economically, and we're going to challenge you intellectually, because we're going to tell the world that your liberal democracy, open this, that, is all rubbish. The way to go is what we are doing. And the Americans, being number one for the previous 50 years or more, they obviously reacted to this challenge. And what they decided was they started introducing a number of anti-Chinese measures in what was earlier a much more open and free system. Now the question arises that what should India do? A simplistic view would be that, the world has changed. Nobody is really interested in openness and globalization and what have you. And we should also change. We should go back to import substitution, Atmanirbhar, Yevo. There are people who hold that view. The other view is that, look, the Americans are doing what they're doing because they're concerned with their own threat to their own security. They're a very rich country, and they're following policies that will hurt them, because by putting protection and so on, they're raising the cost of imports, which will make inflation a bigger problem. But they're rich enough to afford it, okay? It will lead to a bit of a slowing down in global trade, that's true. And that will also hurt us. But to the extent to which the Americans are saying, look, we want to contain China and are not concerned about containing India, maybe it gives us an opportunity. And therefore, the proposition is, should India remain open in order to benefit from the new opportunities which the restructuring of global value chains will give, because the Americans are being anti-Chinese? I think we should. But one consequence of that is, we have to remain open means we must allow imports to come in free of duty or with very low duty. This is where it becomes controversial. Many people think, no, this is the wrong thing to do. The world is closing down, we should also look inwards. And we are a big market, and we should... Now, the short answer is, we're not a tiny market, but we're not a big market. Our share in virtually anything is about 2 or 3% of global trade. So it is not the case that we are so big that we can avoid specializing. And also, if we want to get into global supply chains, we need to attract the global supply chains to base some of their work in India, but they're not going to be relying only on Indian components. Now, if you look at, there's lots of stuff on the internet, that if you look at the smartphone, for example, which Apple is now producing the iPhone in India, and that's been quite a success because, it's a pretty sophisticated instrument. We are only assembling the thing, but we are producing the casing. The Tatas are producing the casing. And by the way, that took a lot of doing because the precision requirements of the casing was such that they had to do a lot of work to make sure that they meet the requirements. Otherwise, the cameras, the screen, the memory chips, lots of the stuff inside, even the motherboard, this printed circuit board is brought in from outside, from different countries, brought into India, assembled here. Now, in due course, when the smartphone production out of India becomes big enough, it may become economic to think of locating some of the component production in India. But if you rush that and say, no, no, now you can't import, you must produce in India, I mean, the thing will just collapse. So I think the need to remain open is a critical strategic choice on which there isn't a common view across. I mean, fortunately, I think the government has taken a reasonably open position because they say we want to be part of global supply chains, global value chains. And a global value chain means that you bring things from outside, do something on them, and export the end result. Not that you bring everything from within the country. But it's an example that, you know, although the world appears to have raised protective barriers, India should not go down the same route. And interestingly, East Asia is not going down that route. I mean, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, they're not doing this. I think it's a pity that we didn't join RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic whatever partnership of Southeast Asian countries, because China was a member. Again, many of our industry people sort of felt that, you know, we'll never be able to compete. We mustn't give the Chinese free access to our market, etc. You know, there is another trade agreement, which is the Comprehensive Trade Partnership Agreement, which includes Japan, includes Korea, includes Australia and some of the other countries. It doesn't include China. So maybe the solution is we should join that. Because China is not there, we would be in there. Again, that's a controversial issue because one of the requirements of that agreement is that a lot of what are called behind the border standards need to be harmonized. You have to move towards global standards in many areas, which traditionally our Commerce Ministry has not been willing to do. And the Commerce Ministry's view is that, has been traditionally, that free trade agreements are about tariffs. But don't ask us to have the same environment standards, the same labor standards, etc., etc. But increasingly, if you want integration with global trade, people are going to insist on that. I mean, certainly when it comes to food and let's say medicines, safety standards, they're not tariffs, but people are not going to be willing to grant Indian production free access to their markets if it is felt that our drug controller standards are very low. So we need to upgrade those big time. So these are examples that when you move from a slogan at the top to working out the detail of policy, you come across alternatives. I shouldn't speak for too long, but I think I'll just take 2 more minutes. You know, policies, when you say, how do you achieve a target? There are 2 ways of achieving a target. One is by reshaping policies. That's what we've been talking about, openness, free import, this, that, and the other. The other is government programs. That is, you must spend some money in order to create the infrastructure needed or to create the public goods needed, etc. And you know, here you come across 2 separate issues. One is that merely spending the money for a program doesn't mean that the money is well spent. So you need a lot of very hard thinking that is the design of this program well conceived? Will it actually achieve the objectives that it's meant to achieve? And if you really want to get a sense of that, you need independent evaluation. You need these programs to be subjected to independent evaluation, and that evaluation feeds back into the government, you know, that look, it's either working or not working. that means you need to encourage a critical evaluation. And if you are going to be sensitive to criticism, then very soon the whole system will work to feedback everything is wonderful. Whereas you know that, I mean, once a system goes down that route, it's very difficult to actually recover. I can give you many examples where the issue of policy design is very often crucial. So I'll just give you one, and this can be multiplied 20 times. You know, one of the problems in the government of India, and I'm now referring to experience problems I face, I'm not making a comment on the current situation, though I'm quite sure the same problem exists even today. See, one of the problems is that ministries are assigned as being responsible for certain things. Okay? So, for example, the Ministry of Women and Child Development is supposed to be responsible for child malnutrition. I mean, improving child nutrition. They have a program, used to have a program, and I'm sure it's there too, where through the Anganwadi system, which looks after kids between the age of 3 and 6, the kids come there and they get a meal, a nutritious cooked meal, okay, for which the government provides the money. The ministry, when we were focusing on the need to take care of child malnutrition, the ministry said it's very simple, we're the relevant ministry, just increase the expenditure on our program. And we were making the point that, look, if you look at what causes child malnutrition, the food that is given through this ministry program only reaches kids between the ages of 3 and 6. 80% of the malnutrition problem happens during the age 0 to 2. So if you're not able to handle that side of the problem, taking corrective steps when the kid is 3 is largely wasted. What do you have to do in the 0 to 2? You have to, clearly the income of the family needs to be supported. That's where, for example, for the very poor people, something like the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Given Program makes a big difference. Education of mothers is extremely important, because most mothers, at least in those days, were not aware of what is the most scientific way of bringing up a child. And I mean, I went into this in some detail, so I'm just surprised that I know about it, but I'll just regurgitate. You know, for example, every expert on child nutrition would say that the most important thing is to make sure that the mother breastfeeds the child. Practically, the first feed the child should have should be from the breast, okay? Now, it happens that for the first couple of days during lactation, the mother's milk is discolored because it contains certain chemicals which actually greatly improve the, if you like, the protection from disease for the kid. But the perception in the villages was that, oh, the milk is not clean yet. So if you give the kid other milk, including drops of honey, whereas what a child expert would tell you is exclusively breastfeed for at least 6 months and maybe even go beyond that. So this is something that can only be taken care of through the health system and the advisory system which works on the mother. And the huge problem there is that the mother is usually under the influence of her mother-in-law, who is a quite tyrannical woman and exercises her own views. And even if the poor nurse says, nahi, nahi, ye theek nahi hai, the mother-in-law would tell the daughter-in-law, no, forget it, all this. What do they know? We know what needs to be done. You need to have clean water, because if sanitation is poor, the kid is going to be subject to diarrheal infection, and most of what goes in will just come out at the other end. So that is something that is not part of the Ministry of Women and Child Nutrition. The health thing is not part of the Ministry of Child and so on. So, you know, there are multiplicity of government agencies which collectively, if they all worked well, would lead to an improvement in child nutrition. But when this matter was discussed, the ministry was of the view, do you want to improve child nutrition or not? Right, yes you do. Well, this is the program. And so explaining to them that, look, it's not that simple, was much more difficult than I would have thought. Now, I can multiply this across the board. So, you know, when you analyze policy, it's very important to embed your narrative in an analysis of what would happen if you do this as opposed to something else. Let me give you one more example and then I'll just shut up. Nowadays, we're all into gender equality, very important, around the world. So what is the proposal that we've come up with? Many states have come up that we must exempt women from bus fares when they ride in buses. And it looks like a stroke of the pen genius, no? I mean, you're certain to get elected because they say 50% of the voters are women, they'll all vote for you. Not a single one has raised the point that if maybe 30% of the passengers in urban areas are women, 30%. So if 30% of the fares disappear, are you going to raise the fares on men, which would be a cross-subsidy, very logical? Or are you going to provide more money to the metropolitan bus service so that it doesn't deteriorate? Nobody has bothered to ask this question. And there are several states, and my guess is almost all states will now do this. This will lead, by the way, to a multiplication. Somebody will say, what about railways? We should exempt women from all rail fares. So you can imagine a cascading kind of series of problems. And in due course, why not? Well, fortunately, we don't have a public sector airline. Otherwise, poor old Air India would be told, no fares for women, you know. I mean, these are just some of the examples that when you do policy analysis, please do a very careful analysis that what's the underlying system, how are you disturbing it, what will it do, and to what extent will it achieve the objectives, and to what extent will it have other consequences which actually move in exactly the contrary direction. So with those words, thank you for listening to me. I'm very happy to answer questions if you have any.